Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Look Up, the news and current affairs programme from M Compass Media. Every week, myself, Finbar Markey, and my co-host, Padraig O'Mwany, will look at news stories that either haven't got into the mainstream media, or on the other hand, maybe haven't had a balanced hearing in the mainstream media. Welcome back, Padraig. How are you?
Not bad, Finbar. We're heading for Christmas now that the Halloween's over, so happy days.
Oh yeah, I cannot wait to have a lie-in Christmas week. It's something that I've been looking forward to for months now. Most people probably don't know, but we work full time and we try to produce this show and do other news items as well. So it can be tough going. So getting a break at Christmas is going to be nice, as I'm sure it is tough going for everybody out there. Lots of news stories to cover this week. Let's get stuck in. The first news story, Padraig, that we're looking at is with regards to Christine Legarde.
Yeah, so Christine Legarde was on the Late Late Show there last week. So I'll give you a quick background. President of the European Central Bank, Christine Legarde, has said she recognised that interest rates were a burden on some people. The ECB raised interest rates again on Thursday, taking steps in tightening policy to fight off a historic surge in inflation. The ECB is raising borrowing costs at the fastest pace on record. Further hikes are almost certain. Speaking on the Late Late Show, Ms. Legarde said the ECB was increasing rates because it is fighting inflation. She said the ECB was not just the custodian of the euro, it also had to fight inflation, which is particularly bad for those on low incomes. Until July, ECB rates had been in negative territory for 8 years. With Thursday's decision, the ECB also increased the rate on the main refinancing operation, which affects mortgage interest rates, to 2% from 1.25. The ECB also cut a key subsidy to banks, but made no hint about plans to start winding down its bond holdings after hoovering up trillions of euro of debt issued by Eurozone governments since 2015. She described Ireland's 50-year membership of the European Union as a story of success and prosperity. She described Russian President Vladimir Putin as a terrifying person and said his actions in invading Ukraine were driven by evil forces. And she then left by presenting host Ryan Tubridy with a jar of honey from hives located at the headquarters building of the ECB in Frankfurt. Is it possible for you to roll that little bit of video we have just on what she said?
But we will go back to some of the stuff that you were saying there, because we have to unpack some of that. But this is a video of Christine Lagarde in relation to where inflation came from.
We do it because we are fighting. We do it because we are fighting inflation. Inflation has just pretty much come about from nowhere. We had been fighting deflation, so when prices were going down, trying to bring them to a steady level so that people knew about stability. And then as a result of very speedy recovery, plus the energy crisis, caused by Mr. Putin, who's decided in an unjustifiable way to invade another country, doesn't do that out of pleasure.
So what she's saying there is that initially inflation began out of nowhere, and then it was all bad Mr. Putin's fault. What do you think about that?
So the real point I was probably trying to make there was she's leaving out some other elements that may have contributed. So is the real cause of interest hikes in any way associated with hard lockdowns over the last 2 years? Is it in any way associated with the supply line devastation from lockdowns, the unprecedented printing of money leading to the greatest wealth heist really by the rich in history, I would say, or big business profiteering and the proxy war really of NATO and the Ukraine? So she's leaving out all of that, Finbar.
Yeah. They have no responsibility or culpability in it at all. The bond buying is a problem as well. So when they can't pay their own debts, they buy their own debts essentially through bond buying. The UK had done a massive, nearly spent all of its reserves on its own bonds to buy its own pensions a few weeks ago. Legarde has been investigated and I believe found guilty in at least one instance of corruption herself. So I think the Late Late Show, which is a public broadcaster, has a bit of a cheek to have her on to their prime time main show of the week, the Late Late Show on a Friday evening, and not question her on any of those things and give her a free ride, which is what the Irish public broadcaster always does anyway. Do you have any closing comments on this before we move on? I'd just like to look at so there's the issue of inflation, which is essentially, people think it's prices going up, but it's really the value of money going down is what's happening with inflation. And interest rates attached to that makes debt far more expensive, especially debt that is aligned and parallel to current interest rates and changing interest rates. So people who have mortgages are in really, really big trouble. A 0.75 hike in interest rates to the average Joe Soap may not sound like very much. It's actually massive. We're in for at least another 2 of those within the Eurozone in the next 6 months, as far as I'm concerned. It's going to put it up to maybe 2% plus. I have seen some reports that the aim is 7 to 8%, which is massive. And they say that they're doing this to reduce inflation, putting the interest rates up so that people will borrow less money and just there'll be less money generally in circulation. But it's a ham-fisted way of trying to do it, because it's going to create massive evictions. And ultimately what it will do, it'll make people like Christine Lagarde wealthier. Because when economies collapse because of these scenarios, it's the IMF that goes into those economies and forces economic policies onto what once would have been sovereign states, and gets to exchange so-called crisis money, to exchange that, and for alleviation, to exchange that for national sovereignty. So Legarde is really at the top of the pyramid when it comes to this process that is happening at the moment, and that has happened before, and that will happen again. I'll just show a graph of the inflation rate, the overall general inflation rate in Europe at the moment, which is standing now for October at 10.7%. And remember, that's suppressed from the point of view that the real inflation rate is probably quite a bit higher than that, but there's certain things not taken into consideration when that's calculated. In Latvia and some Eastern European countries, the inflation rate is in the mid-20s, or heading towards the mid-20s in some cases. That's just unbearable for an economy and for people to try to live through. Do you have any closing comments before we move on to the next subject, Padraig?
Well, it's kind of the way I say it, it's like economic colonization. What's happened here since the banking crisis, and this is just an extension of that. And people like this are wheeled out in front of the Irish public as if they're benign entities that are to be enjoyed and people to be looked up to, maybe, like, you know, so to get out in front of these things. If people know the real story with these people, like, they'd be.
And isn't it just laughable that you listen to Christine Lagarde there, and she has the cheek, the barefaced cheek, to say that because Russia, well, she says Putin, she likes to personalize things, they all do, but because Russia had a military action in Ukraine, and they decided to apply all these sanctions. Nobody else, they decided to apply these sanctions. And yet they're trying to in some way suggest that it's Putin's fault. It's just laughable. It's petty. It's adolescent in nature. It's just unbelievable that these are the people that got to the top and are running the world. It's just shocking. There was an election in Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu won, but he has to go into an alliance, and he's going into an alliance with a guy called Gvir, who is the leader of a really extreme Zionist party in Israel. I'll just read this. Today, the religious Zionist party made history with the biggest win by a national religious party since the country was founded. Gvir and his party are rabidly anti-Palestinian. This is him when he got elected, looking quite ecstatic. But the truth of the matter is that this is the same man that M Compass Media featured maybe 2-3 months ago, when he set up his political office in the garden of a 70-year-old Palestinian woman and her family, and then brought mobs and yobs of extremist Zionist youths to intimidate that family and other families out of their home and off their land. Here we have a human rights organization representative explaining exactly what Gvir has done in that specific instance in that Palestinian family's home and garden.
So we're now in East Jerusalem, and here international law is violated morning, midday and evening every day. To my right is the so-called parliamentary office of one of the incoming prominent Israeli politicians. Itamar Ben Gvir. He is leading this extremist political movement called religious Zionism. What they are organizing is the enforced takeover of Palestinian land, because in this house lives Fatima. She is 70 years old. She's lived all her life in this house. Her parents took it over in 1948. Now these religious extremists are with settler youth, which is really organized crime, coming here and having pogroms where they violently hit Palestinians. They hurt Fatima, 70 years old, her family living in the house. They want to drive them away. They want to transfer settlers to this area. In violation of international law, you cannot transfer your own population to occupied land. It is illegal. This has to stop. We need help from the international community to stop this. Our lawyers are trying as much as they can, but we need help.
And so the pain of the Palestinian people, I think, is going to magnify significantly with the election of Ben Gvir and his extremist Zionist party. I've seen them in action in different videos, and it's cruel. Cruel is not a hard enough word to describe what's going on. Netanyahu has been allowing this to happen anyway, but I can only see this kind of thing ramping up, and I can only see the suppression of the Palestinian people in their own homes is going to increase dramatically in instances. Have you any take on this, Patrick?
It's an indicator when you look at the international community's reaction to the way they see things developing in the Ukraine. It's an indicator when you look at where they're totally missing in action when it's coming to Palestine and the humanitarian need there and the occupation that's gone on.
Yeah.
Shocking.
I think we're going to be following, and we're going to be covering a lot more from Israel because of the election of Ben Gvir and his party alongside Netanyahu, but also because of the pressure that's been put on Iran. And I think the United States is inviting Iran at this stage to partake in an invasion, inviting Israel to partake in some kind of a military action against Iran. So we'll be following this. You wanted to cover a story that's been talked about a little bit in Irish news and also in other countries where a similar instances appears to have occurred. Chinese police station in Dublin ordered to shut. This is from the BBC. It was covered in Irish media as well.
So a Chinese police station in Dublin city centre has been ordered to close by the Irish government after pressure from a human rights group. Chinese authorities said the station offered a service to the Chinese citizens in Ireland, including the renewal of driving licences. However, the human rights group Safeguard Defenders, in a report in September, said the station persuaded 230,000 immigrants to return to China, sometimes to face criminal charges. The Irish Department of Foreign Affairs said no Chinese authority had sought permission to set up the police station. The department said it had raised the matter with the Chinese authorities and had asked them to close and cease operations at the police station on Capel Street. The Chinese government said it had complied with that request. Dutch media found evidence that the so-called overseas service stations, which promise to provide diplomatic services, are being used to try and silence Chinese dissidents in Europe. A spokeswoman for the Dutch Foreign Ministry said the existence of unofficial police outposts was illegal. It's an amazing thing to see, isn't it? Like, I had no idea this was happening.
I have grave doubts that the Irish government did not know that this has been opened. Secondly, I do have to say this, and I know I'm going against the grain here, but I take all media reports, Western media reports from human rights groups and everything else about China with a pinch of salt. Let's give you some examples. The allegations of the genocide of the Uyghur population in China, which is a Muslim population in China. Absolutely no evidence. The only person that's brought forward stories, or one of the main amplifiers of such stories, is an end of days Christian who has dedicated himself to anti-Chinese propaganda and anti-communist propaganda. No actual evidence, no, for a land with so many videos, so many cameras, everything else, no evidence of actual work camps or genocide camps or anything like that. But China, there was a problem that external forces had been trying to fund and arm and create what you might call a radical extremist Islamic movement within China and within the Uyghur community. And the Chinese did, I believe, tackle that. A second thing is this idea of the social credit system that we all believe exists in China, which actually doesn't exist in China whatsoever. There are different systems. For instance, in some cities for rail travel, if you smoke on a train, if you got on a train without paying your job, well, all these things which are penalised here in Ireland and in all other countries, they have a point system there. And eventually, if you keep on breaching the rules on the train and of the metro transport, you won't be allowed on it anymore. I don't know if that's a terrible social credit system that's trying to control people's minds. There's another example. There's one city in China that has developed a system for pet owners that when you get your license, if your pet is out without its owner, you lose a punt. If your pet doesn't have a lead, you lose a punt. If your pet goes around aggressively attacking other animals or attacking people, you lose a punt. And eventually, if that continues to happen, you won't be allowed to keep a pet. So they're the kind of things that exist. There is no grand centralized system in China for social credit systems. And we have similar systems here. For instance, in Ireland, we have a penalty point system for drivers. And if you lose X amount of penalties because of your behavior, you lose your license. So what I've noticed about China, and here's an example, with the Uyghur story, I came across a breakdown of all of the underpinning arguments in relation to saying that there is a genocide of the Uyghur population in China. And documents were presented as evidence. And these documents were actually, for one example would be that there was allegations that Uyghur women and people were being forced into slavery, Uyghur women. And what this actually was a back to work program that provided Chinese women with au pairs or with child minding services, things like that, back to work training, stuff like that. But whoever translated this from the Chinese translated it using the most extreme language possible and quite often made up aspects of the translation to make this look like it was some dystopian policy that forced people into slavery, which was far from the truth. And I've read actual authentic Chinese transcriptions of these documents, and they're just like documents that would be produced by any other government. So I'm really have to be careful, I feel personally, when it comes to what I believe about China, because China has the biggest population in the world. It's one of the most influential economies in the world. And there are parties and agencies that are jealous of the growth and development of China. We all know who those parties are. They're mainly principally based in the EU, in the UK, and in the United States. And they will do anything and everything to destabilize. And eventually they're aiming towards a war with China. Now, this is all my opinion, but it's based on research. It's just not coming out of the air. And I would counsel anybody who's interested in this particular subject matter and is watching to look into this kind of stuff for yourself. And you might be surprised that China is a very, very developed nation that has pulled its population out of extreme poverty in a very short period of time. And I think that we need to be fair enough with our global partners, which China is a globe. We can't pretend China doesn't exist. We can't go to war with China. So we have to try to understand China and not see it through the prism of those that are jealous of China's development. Sorry about that lecture, but it's something that does bear on my mind sometimes when I see stories about China, that we have to be careful about them. Now, when it comes to this Dublin police station thing, I don't really know what the background to it is.
Yeah, so I would say I would be quite suspicious of some of the news outlets myself. Like, mainstream media outlets have been proven to be quite misleading an awful lot of the time in recent years. I would retain a concern about not so much Chinese oversight of their nationals in foreign countries, because this was a bit of a surprise to me. Maybe it does go on, but I hadn't seen or heard of it before, so no major insight into that. But in terms of social credits and stuff like that, I'd retain a skepticism there and be looking at it. I wouldn't be so sure that isn't happening. There's such a big population there. So look, we'll watch this space and see how it develops.
Yeah, and if any of the viewers have an opportunity to research it a little bit yourself, you might surprise yourself in what you come up with, as long as you're not taking everything from RTE, BBC, CNBC, things like that. Look for individuals that have excelled themselves because of their own independent writing, would be my advice on that subject. Our next subject matter is delayed cancer diagnosis as a result of the lockdowns in 2020 and 21 and moving into early, well, they were finished by 2022, I suppose. Taoiseach warns of frightening wave of delayed cancer diagnosis next year. Do you want to run with the story, Porter?
Yeah, so Mr. Martin said medical experts have warned him of dramatically increasing cancers because of delayed diagnosis linked to the impact of COVID-19 on health services. During the first wave of COVID from March to May 2020, a time of strict limits on travel and gathering when many people cocooned, there was a significant drop in the number of people presenting to doctors with concerns about cancer. While this was in line with international experience, Mr. Martin described to party members the warnings from the medical profession. What they told us was very sobering, he said. All over Europe, this has been seen, and it's going to hit us in the next year. Delayed diagnosis, too late for medicine. It was quite frightening. The Taoiseach's comments come as new figures reveal that monthly cancer referrals from GPs are up by as much as 52% compared to 2019, the last full year before the pandemic hit. The data released by Health Minister Stephen Donnelly to Aintu's Peadar Tóibín reveals that from January to August this year, GP cancer e-referrals to rapid access clinics are at 136.5% of 2019 activity. A study by the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland said the number of reported cancer resections, which is the process of cutting out tissue or part of an organ, in 2020 was 96% of 2019 figures. A 4% reduction in activity equates to 740 fewer cancer resections, leading to concerns that these cancers went untreated. However, Mr. Tóibín, who requested the figures, described the situation as worrying. Aintu will call on the government to facilitate a Dáil debate on these figures as soon as possible. It's really appalling that our cancer screening services in this country were closed for such a long length of time during the pandemic. Cancer services must always be recognised as essential services. He said the trends in cancer diagnosis and referrals and the stage of cancer at the time of diagnosis must be examined properly by experts in the months and years ahead to see what impact the closure of much of the health service had on survival rates and outcomes for cancer patients. In Ireland in 2020 found the urgent e-referral to the rapid access clinics, breast, lung and prostate fell on average by 58% at their lowest point compared to pre-pandemic averages. Overall, surgical oncology activity in 2020 was 82.2% of 2019 levels. The remarkable thing for me here, Finbar, is that Mr. Martin is reporting his shock at this. This was widely touted to him as a major hazard of the lockdowns.
There's two very opposing headlines from the same person. About the same person. In 2021, April 2021, what Taoiseach says get real when asked about cancer care backlog. Here we have this week, Taoiseach warns of frightening wave of delayed cancer diagnosis next year. So they were warned about this at the time, and those that warned them were put down upon and were told to get real as though they were in some way outside of reality. Reality is coming back to kick Micheál Martin in the proverbial arse, as they say. But if that's going to be of no consolation to all of those people who have delayed diagnosis of cancer and may die when they didn't have to die, and all because these guys wouldn't get real. Any final words on that, Porter, before we move on?
It's kind of disgusting, really. Like, it was like we had the exemptions for certain things. We had TDs having junkets and getting away with it. Like, well, other people were prosecuted for their crimes of being out of their home. These people were getting away with it. And here we are closing down essential services for people. And there's going to be death on the back of it.
Yeah. We have a video coming up now. If this video doesn't show, if you're watching this on YouTube or on Facebook and you don't see the video that we're about to play, it's because we weren't allowed to put it up. We've had a number of videos removed from Facebook and YouTube recently. All the shared factor in them all is that they at one point or another mentioned COVID in them. So if you can't get this on Facebook or YouTube, get onto our Telegram channel and you'll find it there. That's Compass Media on Telegram. But this is from New Zealand. I won't comment much on it other than to say it purports that to suggest that the New Zealand government will be identifying as potential terrorists people who argued with the COVID narrative during the COVID lockdowns, and particularly in relation to vaccines. Have a look at this.
Our Secret Service is launching an initiative to help us identify people who may have been radicalised.
Know the Signs details dozens of indicators that a friend or family member could be planning a terror attack. As Adam Hollingworth reports, the move comes as our spy chiefs identify a new and worrying type of terrorism.
Time was when the intelligence services were never seen, never heard. But now they're loudly proclaiming your country needs you, to keep an eye on those you know and, if necessary, dob them in.
Recognising a potential warning sign and then alerting NZSAS or police could be the vital piece in the puzzle that ultimately saves lives.
To that end, they're publishing a guide called Know the Signs to help us all identify potential terrorists in our midst.
To pay attention and to be alert, so that if they see or hear about something that seems off, that worries them and concerns them, they might have a look at this information to say, does this indicate to me that this person is on the road to actually committing an attack?
The SIS has listed around 50 signs, from obvious ones, like writing on a weapon, as happened in Christchurch, to
a person who is really developing an us versus them worldview.
Authorities say they're usually closely monitoring 40 to 50 potential terrorists. These people used to be motivated by their white identity or by their faith. But in the past 6 months, a third group has emerged, those motivated by politics.
And so it could be the COVID measures that the government took, or it could be other policies that are interpreted as infringing on rights. And it's what I sometimes describe as a kind of hot mess of ideologies and beliefs.
So, Miss Ketteridge there, I have to comment on our cows, like, I can't help it. Before we move any further, what is she doing with that hairstyle? Anyway, we'll try not to lower ourselves. Very worrying development from New Zealand. I'm sure that she's just saying out loud what's happening all around the world, especially in the Western Hemisphere, so Eurocentric countries and the United States. I'm sure they all have people who have argued in one way or another with the state narrative, to have them in their sights as potential terrorists into the future. What do you think about that?
It's insane, really. It's hard to find words for it, because it seems to ebb and flow in different directions, and it'll go whatever way it suits them, really. To classify things as dangerous extremism, whatever suits them, really, isn't it? Put you in a category when they it could mean free speech, like, you know.
Yeah. And her face, even when you look at that image there, she just looks very angry and very, I don't know. She's as terrifying looking as the world is becoming. I suppose she personifies that to a certain degree. We've got housing news in Ireland. Cabinet approves measures for refugee beds, community funding. Everyone deserves a home. Plans to house up to 200 refugees in Mahon received mixed reaction. What do you want to run with this, Porter?
Yeah, I'll just have a little bit on this. There's two parts of it. So the question I'm putting to you, Finbar, is government policy feeding the far right? Okay, so the Cabinet has signed off on a range of measures to increase the supply of accommodation for refugees. Minister for Integration Roderick O'Gorman said the government was seeking to move from the emergency phase to a more medium to long-term strategy. In a statement, the government said the Minister for Rural and Community Development and Minister for Housing will work with colleagues to develop a 50 million programme support. A call out for vacant homes has been initiated to be led by local authorities. A refusal policy has been introduced, meaning people who refuse an offer of suitable accommodation will not be offered another option. It is understood that development is an effort to ensure refugees move out of hotels when they are offered more permanent accommodation. The government has also been expected to sign off on a proposal to increase the monthly payment to families who host refugees from €400 to €800. Ministers were also expected to agree to a proposal that would see future hotel contracts for refugees to exclude the provision of free meals, as there is concern that some refugees have torn down the provision of alternate accommodation, as they would have to pay for food if they moved out of hotels. It is also understood the government was looking at providing beds for 90 refugees in Kilbride Army Camp in County Wicklow. A further 70 beds made available in a variety of other camps over the coming weeks. Among these will be barracks in Mullingar, Cavan and Tralee. The government was also set to commission research into the long-term needs of Ukrainian refugees, including schooling and accommodation. Taoiseach has said that there were significant challenges ahead in relation to finding enough accommodation here for people fleeing the war in Ukraine and for other applicants for international protection. The second part of it then is domestic housing crisis. So a recent Examiner article interviewed locals near the site of a modular homes project in Matton, County Cork, which would give some contrast and insight. So this is what was said when interviewed. I don't think it's good, one interviewee said. A lot of people here living with their own parents because they can't get a house. It's not fair. I have nothing against the Ukrainians. It's the government that are not managing it well. A lot of people here are already on the housing waiting list, he said. Two women who were also interviewed gave their thoughts. There's a desperate need for housing and Christmas is coming up. We have nothing against the Ukrainian refugees, but we have a housing need here too. Nicole Gvir was visiting family who live near the modular home site. She lives with her 5 children in a 2-bedroom home in Blackpool that her landlord is now selling, and she may face moving her family into a homeless shelter. There's a desperate need for housing and Christmas is coming up. We have nothing against them, but we have a housing need here too, said her friend. Like what's basically happening, in my view, is the government policy is creating a situation now where very moderate people who have absolutely no inclination within their makeup to have prejudice or racist thoughts or any type of discrimination against other people. They're putting them in a situation where their very survival, you know, in terms of where they live with their families, how they're going to cope, and they're putting it up against provisions that's been made for refugees who rightly Ireland should look after refugees fleeing war as a country that has a good history of it in humanitarian aid. Absolutely, there should be no problem with that. But the problem is, why do they have to disadvantage Irish people on housing lists for a very long time? And why are they doing that? It's overtly creating division.
I think I do have a problem with taking a massive number of refugees and yet contributing to the cause of those refugees being refugees in the first place, by failing to call for peace, by failing to call for negotiations, by failing to call for an end to the constant flow of arms into a war zone, the constant refusing to accept and acknowledge that Ukraine is not an innocent party in these matters, and that in fact it's not a Ukraine-Russia war anymore, it's a NATO-Russia war. Those people are fleeing in fear. I understand that. They need shelter, but they shouldn't have to flee at all. And that's the gripe, that's the rub in all of this. In terms of our own politicians opening up the doors to the point where there's no cap, and they've said this time and again, there will be no cap to the number of Ukrainian refugees taken into Ireland that want to come. The infrastructure of Ukraine is now being hit. And if they maintain their stance of no cap, we're going to have a situation here which is 10 times as bad within the next couple of months. 10 times as bad. And people are getting annoyed on a daily basis. I work and I live in the community, and I'm very much involved in my community. And on a daily basis, people's patience are wearing thinner and thinner. And it will turn into anger. It already is the suppressed anger to a degree. And it's the people who are getting annoyed, they don't see their politicians every day to get annoyed with them. They live behind big high walls. It's the Ukrainian refugees that they see, and I'm concerned that at some point there will be flashpoints, unnecessarily so. Just on the housing issue. Last week, so as I said, I do voluntary work with a homeless organization. And last week, we moved a woman who, with her 3 children, this time last year, was living in a car. We moved them into a house a few nights ago. And they went into the house, they got the HAP house, so it's a private tenancy house. They got that last week, but there was no furniture in it. So we had to move in with furniture a couple of nights ago. And the 3 children, I've never seen such beaming, happy children, to see a chair being brought into their house, to see a sofa, a bed, smiling from ear to ear, to the point that I think if somebody had jumped on their toes, it wouldn't have got rid of their smiles. They were so, and although it was a wonderful thing to see, those big beaming smiles, it should never have been in the first place. And those 3 children, by the fact that they were smiling so much, it tells me that they have been scarred and they have been traumatized by their experience. And that's why this extreme smile and happiness was coming through. So that's going on a daily basis, multiplied right across the country. And this policy that the state has of taking in more and more people that we clearly cannot cope with, so that they can pander to their European bosses in the hope that when they get out of politics at the next elections, they'll get some plum European job. And that's what I believe is really their mindset, with not being able to say no to the EU. And so
there's two things that I'd underline there, Finbar. One is that I fully believe that the Irish government have the capacity to end the homeless crisis domestically in Ireland, and they haven't done so. They haven't done so because I believe that they have a privatisation policy there where housing's concerned, and they're not going to buck the trend on that. But they could end that tomorrow. But it's the inequality that they're creating, and I suppose the where I wanted to go with the question was, I think that there's a very, very minute number of actual far right or extreme right wing activist groups in the country. But this type of thing is like, it's heaven for them, because it's doing the work for them. Like, it's raising sentiment, or giving the possibility of raising sentiment.
But the other problem is, isn't it, that anybody, and we've seen it from a story we ran last week about the Taoiseach, which was the Irish Prime Minister, and him trying to align or to conflate people who question their policy on this issue with being right-wing or extreme right-wing. There is the danger that lots of people who decide they want to question this, because it's so obviously something that needs to be questioned, about the sustainability of this policy. Anybody who questions it, if they're labelled right-wing in the media and by certain political spheres, and if they're politically innocent enough that they have not really got involved in politics before, maybe they'll start believing they are right-wing. Maybe they'll think, well, maybe that's what I am, when they're actually not. And yet they'll go into the arms of these organizations. So, yeah, lots of problems in this situation. I don't know how it's going to end. In the charity work that we do, we assist Ukrainian people just as much as anybody else, and we try not to see them as any different. But I don't think necessarily the public may be geared towards that into the future, when it becomes a them and us in terms of access to basic services.
But especially not when people give the explanation, well, here's your problem here, type of thing, Yeah.
Just on the final housing issue, the Housing League, the Revolutionary Housing League, I think that's their name. They have been in the news every so often. They've taken over a building in Dublin. They're housing homeless people in that building. That building got raided maybe a month and a half ago, and the homeless people and the activists were put out. The other morning, they were raided again at an encampment or a safe space for homeless people to have their tents and things like that. And the forces of the Irish state went in and removed them early in the morning. This is just a video of it here. You've been following the Revolutionary Housing League for a short while, Padraig, and just their actions within the city. This comes as no surprise, I presume.
No, it's a continuation of activism that they've been doing. They have been leading from the front, really, like taking direct action and trying to provide alternatives to just living inside the street for people. And it's commendable that what they're trying to do. So really, it's needless again, Finbar. Like as we've said throughout the last every week we've been doing this. There's so many overlapping things with housing. It's needless. The government could easily provide shelter for people in city centre. It could be done tomorrow. There's no political will to do that. And why is that?
Empty houses all over the country, keeping the values of the properties up for the for what you might call the interested parties that may also support the currently governing parties. Okay, we'll move on to the next story. We're looking at protest, because people are not taking this lying down. Again, every week we look at protests. We're going to look at Germany. Moldova protests have got a little bit violent as well. So we'll see a few videos from there. And there's been a few developments outside of Europe too. Here's first of all a video from Dresden in Germany. We also have a video from Schwarschau in Saxony in Lower Germany. I'm noticing more and more with these protests, more and more Russian flags go on display. I think it's kind of people saying that we want a rapprochement with Russia and we want to get their energy supplies back so that this crazy economic business comes to an end. So I think that's what they're saying with that. There are also protests in Moldova. They've been happening for the last few weeks. They're getting bigger and bigger, but now they're starting to turn violent. These protests are mainly against NATO involvement in their country and their country being used as a base to attack Russia into the future. A few weeks ago, we covered the fact that the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, had called for a grand march or a great walk from Lahore to Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, in protest at the fact that he was banned for life from running in elections in Pakistan. And many believe that there was a coup d'etat against Imran Khan and that US interests were behind it. There have been some massive protests, and that walk initially appeared like it was going to be successful. However, things have turned violent today and this evening in Pakistan. Imran Khan, there was an assassination attempt. Someone opened up with what appeared to be an Uzi or some kind of smaller submachine gun of some sort on Imran Khan and some of his followers. Video footage of that here. So terrible scenes coming out of Pakistan. This is an image of the shooter. You can see it's not the guy with the Fila shirt, it's the guy in front in black. The guy in the Fila shirt, initial reports are that he probably saved a lot of lives by disarming or helping to disarm this man. You can see that there's a young boy in front of him as well there. Tonight, since that and post the shooting of Imran Khan, who was shot in the leg, he's not fatally wounded or anything like that, thank goodness. But since that, demonstrations which were full of music and joy have turned a lot more angry. Was hoped, the Pakistani people had hoped that Khan would be able to move them away from control by international forces and also to modernize and make Pakistan a far more progressive country in many ways. What's happened over the last few months from the deposition or the coup, as some people are calling it, against Khan up until his attempted assassination tonight does not bode well for the immediate future of Pakistan and possibly the wider region as well. Any comment on this, Patrick?
It's quite surprising as well. Very well known figure. I think he was big in the cricket world, wasn't he? Yeah. So yeah, big news. How bad was I think it was just shot in the leg, was it?
Yeah. We will be following this story up on Compass Media. So if you want to tune in every so often to see what's happening since last week and the week before, in fact, for the last 3 weeks, we have covered the protests growing demonstrations and protests across Haiti against potential US intervention in Haiti, but also against foreign control of gangs and the emplacement of a president after the last president was assassinated a few months ago, the emplacement of an unelected president by the United States. We predicted that those protests, which appeared joyous, again, was full of music and song, hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million people out in the streets. That turned violent again. A journalist was shot outside of a police station.
Ça, son journaliste, la police baille-balle, qui te vient dans porter support pour libérer Robert dimanche. Comment monsieur encore Romelo?
That was Romeo Vilson, a journalist in Haiti, from Haiti, who was shot outside a Port-au-Prince police station in Haiti. I think it was yesterday, or no, it was 2 days ago, in fact. So the situation in Haiti is starting to turn very hot as well. And the world just seems to be in so much turmoil at the moment. Any comment on this one, Padraig, about Haiti?
Yeah, Haiti has suffered for a very long time with colonization, really, from the US, whether it be economic or not. It's similar to Cuba in many ways, I think. So you'd like to see these people get a break for once, you know?
Yeah. Haiti was the only slave state to ever succeed in its existence. Some might say Liberia in Africa, but Haiti was definitely the first through a revolution, and it has never been allowed to flourish. I suppose for two reasons. First, the United States and other countries wanted to show the world that slaves can't make it by themselves. And secondly, the United States does not want to have a left-wing or a people-centered government on its, what it would describe as its doorstep in the Caribbean. Moving on now to Barack Obama. Barack Obama got a hell of a heckling, if you want to put it like that, a hell of a heckling this week in relation to his involvement in the mess that is Ukraine, and the fact that it was Obama's administration that carried out the coup d'etat against the democratically elected government in Ukraine in 2014 that has us in this mess today. Have a look at this.
You overthrew Ukraine in 2014! You overthrew the legitimate Ukraine in 2014! Tell us about your plans for nuclear war with Russia!
It must take a lot of guts to do something like that. We've seen a lot of it recently where stand-up Americans, independent minds and voices are facing down politicians in these kind of scenarios where the politicians are surrounded by their adoring fans, but they're still willing to speak their truth. Have you noticed an escalation in this kind of thing over the last while, Padraig?
Yeah, but there's loads of dissent out there. Some people are quite aware of the devastation that the US has caused to the world in general. Well, they really took over from the British Empire, like devastating nations all over the world. And I think Claire Daly called it very well last week when she named the Roll of Honor of all the places they visited. So
yeah. There were protests in Brazil this week after the very tight election results, presidential election results there between Bolsonaro and De Silva, or you might know De Silva more as Lula. A lot of people aren't happy about the results. They were very tight. They may not have been so tight had there not been attempts to suppress the vote by some aspects of the military and police in certain parts of Brazil to try to suppress the vote for Lula da Silva. Here's a video of some protests in Brazil against the election of da Silva.
A Globo nunca vai mostrar isso. Você tem aqui no balanço geral Rio de Janeiro. Olha lá como tá bonito.
O Rio de Janeiro é prioridade na tela da Record. Você vê que é uma manifestação pacífica.
Significant crowds there, but it's a very largely populated country as well. It kind of grates me a little bit when I see people supporting these protests and speaking about Lula da Silva as though he's some extremist, Marxist, crazy guy who wants to oppress the population or something. And yet they don't actually know the history of Lula da Silva compared to Bolsonaro. Da Silva has always been people-orientated. He has been elected, this is the third time, as president of Brazil. In his first two terms, He rose up the living standards of Brazil significantly. He cleaned up the place. He cleaned up a lot of crime. He protected the rainforests. He did so many positive things for Brazil and, in fact, for the world. And particularly for the Brazilian people. He was a union representative all his life, but he was also a prisoner. Because in 1968, when there was a coup d'etat against the democratically elected government in Brazil, it was a Labour government, and there was a military coup d'etat supported by the United States. Lula da Silva protested and demonstrated against the coup d'etat and in favour of democracy, and he spent his time in jail. At that time, the military and police were committing massacres and suppressing by killing political opponents and activists. Whilst Lula da Silva was in prison, trying to stop that and fighting against that horrible tyrannical behaviour, Bolsonaro was in the army that was committing these crimes. Lula da Silva was ousted as president due to corruption allegations, which were eventually, under Bolsonaro's rule, were eventually proven by the courts to be trumped up charges, but he did time in prison, but he was in prison before for standing up for his rights. So when I see these protests against his election, I understand the impulse behind them. People have been wound up to a large degree, and there seems to be a play on sovereignty and the idea that in some way da Silva will hand away Brazil's sovereignty to the United States or some other country. In reality, Bolsonaro is far more akin to the United States than da Silva. And da Silva, throughout his entire tenureship, has not played ball when it comes to the United States and the EU when things are not right. And if he feels something is not right, he doesn't play along. And I think that's something that all of the demonstrators now in Brazil are actually calling out for. Here's a headline that might be interesting in terms of the type of leadership that Lula da Silva will give on the international stage in the next 5 years. Brazil's ex-president Lula claims Zelensky equally to blame for war. Lula, who is leading President Bolsonaro in polls, he's won now, also said Biden and EU are guilty and could have stated Ukraine would not join NATO. So there's somebody who's straight talking. A lot of people pre-election might be afraid to say those things. He still got elected because his supporters know he's a straight up kind of guy who says things as they are and acts upon what's right rather than what's suitable for his career or anybody else's career. What do you think about this whole Bolsonaro da Silva situation?
It's got echoes of nearly what's gone on in the USA. Like, it seems to be like polarized. There's two different entities there, like, and it seems like a lot of people, when they look into these things, they find objectivity difficult. They buy a package. They're buying a left narrative or they're buying a right narrative, and they take what comes with the package, like, rather than standing back and being objective and saying, well, listen, somebody gets described as a Marxist, well, some people are totally turned off, and other people, they may have issues, let's say climate orientated or whatever, and like, people really have to look at people on their own merits, and not just be swayed by these type of things, these narratives that are out there.
When he got elected initially in 2002 and again in 2007, the economically conservative or economically right-wing media painted a future picture of a Brazil that all investors would pull out of, a Brazil that was going to economically collapse because they had a left-wing guy in government, and that he was going to do this, that, and the other. But he didn't. He played everything very cleverly. He didn't fall out with anybody, and yet he rose up the living standards of the people of Brazil very, very significantly. And I think that's what grates on the wealthy people in Brazil and outside of Brazil who want to basically rob Brazil and get its resources for little to nothing. They're the kind of people who are against Lula da Silva and who are in favour, in my opinion, of Bolsonaro. Whether you believe in climate change or not, I think we'd all agree that things like the Amazon rainforest, which is primarily in Brazil, but in neighbouring countries as well, the Amazon rainforest is the lungs of the world and has a great, great value. Bolsonaro has opened up the rainforests to being cut down and for exploration for minerals. Lula protects the rainforest as much as possible. I think if that's all he does, even, I think we should be preferential towards Lula, or I am anyway, and I'll be open about that. And we'll move on to the next story, which looks at Ukraine and where we are with Ukraine this week. Here's a map of Ukraine, what some people would now call West and South Russia. And this is the war zone, or the battle lines, which is massive, well over 1,000 miles long. There's battles happening all along these lines. Over the last 3 or 4 weeks, Ukraine has been throwing in relatively small numbers of offensive forces right along this battle line, but particularly around the Kherson region. They're reinforcing Bakhmut, which is a very important place for them. It's heavily, heavily fortified. But ultimately, the slight advances that they had in Kherson region have come to a grounding halt over the last few weeks. And Russia is now starting to advance, Russian forces are starting to advance eastwards into Ukraine to try to solidify what they have, and to, what I suspect will be to create some kind of a buffer zone to prevent Ukraine from bombing Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and even the Crimea regions as well. On top of that, the missile attacks and the drone attacks on power infrastructure in Ukraine has continued this week, and possibly to a degree might have even intensified a little bit compared to last week. It would appear that the Russians are wearing down the supplies of parts that Ukraine will have to fix their power infrastructure, because it's Soviet designed power infrastructure. And so those parts have to come from Russia eventually when their own supplies are dwindled down. And this appears to be, from what I can see, a system or a strategy of the Russians to try to bring the Ukrainians to the table. And the sooner they come to the table, the sooner this kind of stuff would stop. I remember distinctly Putin saying at the beginning of this that the longer it goes on, the more that Ukraine is going to end up losing, because the Russians will have no choice but to keep on moving forward until an agreement is come to. So we've had a lot of talk over the last few weeks about the attacks on this infrastructure. And I believe for the first time, water supplies were hit in a couple of cities. Whether that was intentional or not, I don't know. But they were cut off. And there was an outcry about this, and rightly so. All civilians should have a right to water, to clean water. I did find a video of who is now President Zelensky of Ukraine when he was a comedian not that long ago. Some might say he still is, but when he was a comedian not that long ago, he did one of his sketches on how funny it is that the Ukraine had cut off for years and continued to cut off the water supply to Crimea and to the people of Crimea. And Zelensky found this hilariously funny. Let's have a look.
Который только что закончил курортный сезон Крым и приехал к нам в столицу. Присаживайтесь. Спасибо. Итак, ответьте на интересующий всех вопрос. Каково же сейчас в Крыму? Вы слышите меня? Уважаемые, я говорю, ответьте, каково же сейчас живется в Крыму?
Да хрен с ним, это вода.
Это вода, да.
Можно водички?
Да, конечно, вот стаканчик.
Не надо стакан. И голову помой. Ой, как мне хорошо сейчас в Крыму. Ой, хорошо.
I'm not showing this video to kind of say, oh, well, they deserve it because they did it. That's not what this is about. It's showing the quality of the person and the fact that cutting off water supplies to an entire population of people was quite funny to him until it happened to his own. And I have got a feeling that he doesn't really care too much about his own anyway. That's the conclusion that I'm starting to draw. What do you think about that contrast between on the one hand, these statements coming out every day about Ukrainian infrastructure being hit and that it's genocide? That's what they're trying to call it now, genocide. And on the other hand, that sketch that he did about 3 years ago in relation to Crimea having no water.
It's propaganda in front of your eyes. You look back in history and you hear about propaganda going back to world wars and things like that. And it's as live and well as ever today, if not enhanced. The selection of a professional, maybe not the best actor in the world, like as the leader of the country, is quite suspect as well. I know there was a change of leadership there, 2014 around that period. So how Zelensky even got in and how he's backed I
can tell you how Zelensky got in. Zelensky ran, well, he got billionaire money in the support of the US and the UK, but he ran on a platform of making peace in the East. And when he got elected, he put on what I believe to be a pretense of trying to make peace. And there's a famous or an infamous video out there now where he met the extreme far-right militia, which is the National Guard of Ukraine, fascists basically, white supremacists, and they met out in the forest somewhere, and this was all filmed, and they basically told Zelensky to go and shove it, that they're not going to stop the war in the East. Whether that video was real or whether that was acted out with Zelensky or not, to make it look like he tried anyway, I don't know. But the bottom line is, he ran on a platform of making peace in the East, and he and his cohorts did the exact opposite of that. So that's how he got elected. There has been no plebiscite. There has been no democratic process since 2009 when he got elected to establish how they feel now. And I have a growing feeling that a lot of people in Ukraine have been held hostage because the political parties have been banned, opposition political parties have been banned. All media now has to go through the state broadcaster. Basically, it's a censorship process. Journalists have disappeared. Politicians have been beaten up in their offices. We have people who are being tied to poles on a daily basis in Ukraine and been beaten. There seems to be no rule of law. Anybody who questions the government policy has been accused of being a collaborator. So I've got a feeling that the people of Ukraine are actually being held hostage to a degree by Zelensky and the other agents that surround Zelensky. We're going to close up tonight. We didn't have time to find anything funny or witty or anything like that for tonight. But we are going to close up on some news from the north of Ireland. Padraig, you're going to lead with this one.
So there was what was described as a loyalist threat. I'm not sure how worried now government officials are, but I'll run it anyway. The PSNI has said it has appropriate and proportionate policing operation in place for any visits to the north of Ireland by ministers from the Republic of Ireland following the publication of a letter by the Loyalist Communities Coalition, the LCC. Police said they were aware of the letter sent to the political leaders warning of dire consequences should there be a form of joint authority to plug the power vacuum following the passing of the deadline to restore power sharing and the departure of stand-in ministers. The Northern Ireland office has said joint authority is not under consideration. The letter states that the Irish government should not be visiting Northern Ireland whilst the protocol remains, unless and until there's significant change of attitude and recognition of the legitimate interests of the Unionist and Loyalist community. The response from the Taoiseachs was the 26th county government response has condemned the Loyalist threats to politicians south of the border. This comes amid threats from terrorists in the north that if the government continues to demand joint authority with London in the event of a continuing Stormont impasse. Taoiseach said he's not yet received the Garda risk assessment, although I may get some briefing later, he added. He said he would condemn any person who advocates violence. We've all seen and witnessed in our lives the appalling impact that violence has had on people on this island, Micheál Martin said. I would say to those involved to stop and desist from these kinds of threats. It's politics and politicians engaging with each other that can resolve these issues, and it's reprehensible that anybody would threaten any politician. Mr. Martin indicated he had no information on when an election might be called in the north, with Northern Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris meeting the parties in Belfast. The poll has to be called within 12 weeks of the recent breakdown, and there's been speculation about an election on December the 15th. The government's position was that it wanted to see the outcome of the last election respected. He said, we want to see political stability in Northern Ireland. There's an obligation on all politics to work towards stability, to make sure we don't go backwards and respect the Good Friday Agreement and building the foundations that are there. That's in terms of reconciliation and of building understanding between communities and different traditions. He added, I make the point as well that the outcome of this election should be vindicated and validated. The elections took place in May under the existing framework, and therefore the posts of First Minister and Deputy First Minister should be allocated. So, Finbar, like I wouldn't take this to be too extreme in nature. I don't think the capabilities of the groups that are in existence today are anywhere like the levels that they were before the Good Friday Agreement. But it's indicative of something that's been rolling on since, right, between 98 and maybe 2005. There was a lot of people looking on at the process that went on. They were happy that it brought peace and stopped the killing. But there was a belief that it would lead within time to the republic, as we would envisage it, going back through history, and what that means, like a fully sovereign, independent country. We're not going there, I don't believe. I think it's some type of a watered down Commonwealth agreed Ireland that we're heading for.
But you said that you don't think the energy or whatever is needed for loyalists to create a paramilitary campaign. I think that's what you're saying, that it's not really there. I'm not sure about that, because it was loyalists on their own never created anything from the point of view of paramilitary campaigns. They were always encouraged and facilitated and financed and armed by elements of the British state, who quite often were operating outside of the remit of even their own governments sometimes. So the real concern would be who's in MI5, who's in MI6, who's in British military intelligence that may be passionate enough from the loyalist point of view to say, well, okay, let's start shaking things up a little bit.
All they need to do these days are just make those noises. I don't think that that they really want to see power back over. Like, I mean, there is still huge power over communities in the north, on both sides, but particularly on the loyalist side, where they're very much drug gangs and criminals.
I was about to say that I lived in East Belfast for a significant period back in the early noughties, and the only thing that I would say might hold them back is they might be afraid of losing their drug money if people come down on them really, really hard. I think there was a agreement, if not an unspoken agreement, that the criminality involved in terrorism in the north of Ireland would be allowed to become either legalized by these criminals being allowed to have their money cleaned and put into clean businesses, or on the other hand, a blind eye has been turned quite often once they don't go back to their old ways of political terrorism. So
they have maintained like the stranglehold that some of these groups have on their communities, and they've done it complicitly. Like
through drugs.
Well, the British state has allowed them certain positions within the community and has promoted them as community leaders and stuff, like, you know, so they have a certain tolerance for them, and they will use them as for propaganda reasons. Like, I mean, talking about this protocol, like the British deep state, I suppose, the MI5, MI6 that are there, that are still there, that haven't been removed. Like, there's people think like that, you know, the Good Friday Agreement has changed everything, but they're still there, embedded and meshed in there. And if they feel the need to create a certain line of propaganda, well, the loyalists are there for that. And even Republicans as well, they'll use them as well. Like, they can have false flags all over the place just to create these narratives.
I think we'll watch this space with regard to that. That's all we have for today's show, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Tune in again at the end of next week, where we'll bring you news that you're not going to see on TV. Good night from me.
Good night from me, Finbar. Thank you very much.